This morning, I was asked to do something, and I'm going to kind of blend it with today. And that is, many of you are going to be going to Nauvoo at the beginning of next month. However, to be honest, I can't stand before you on Easter Resurrection Sunday and not make reference to that. Because to be honest, and don't, for those of us, we're going to, Robin and I, is without what we are remembering this week, Nauvoo would be meaningless. What we would be doing would be meaningless. So, that being said, what I want to do is I want to take a historical approach, and we'll cover some things, but to be honest, we have next Sunday where I'll be leading a class on Nauvoo, and so we can get even more into the historical aspect. But I wanted to start by looking at what history is. We are part of history. We are making history. Now, whether that's a good history or a bad history depends on what we do with what we have and what we have opportunity to experience. History is events plus people. And whether we look at Nauvoo or we look at this week, where we look at Jesus and the disciples, or whether we look at this generation, you and I, what happens is we find that people plus events will create that history. And so what they had to deal with in Nauvoo is similar to the daily events that we have to deal with today. They had to go through much of the same routine that we go through today. They had to eat their meals. They had to do that which is healthy in order to provide life. They had to raise children. They had to interact one with another. They had to try to become one. And what we see when we look at Nauvoo is a very complex situation. I have been involved for the last 2.5 years, an invitation to be part of a meeting of LDS, Community of Christ, and Restoration. And we have committed to meeting for 5 years, twice a year, and we've done that with the exception of one time where we could not get together. I only share that because it's not that that group is any more significant than other groups that are meeting. It's not that anything's going to be particularly accomplished. If you would start to ask questions and say, well, what's the purpose and what will be the outcome and what is going to happen between the groups, to be honest, what's happening is an interchange of ideas. But I bring that up today because 1.5 years ago, our meeting was in Nauvoo. And what we found in our discussions, and we have day-long discussions, and sometimes carries into an extra day because we sometimes meet on weekends, is that we see that people could experience or hear the story and come to very different perspectives as to what it's about. Now, on Thursday, if you were here, you would have seen a very remarkable gathering. And that is right here where I'm standing. There was the recreation of the 12 disciples and Jesus. And each one of the disciples gave their perspective. And if you were here, one of the things you'll remember about that is that they could be in the same place with Jesus and have a different experience, because what happens is that we understand history is that we see it through our eyes. And seeing it through our eyes isn't the fact that I'm seeing the room right now from where I'm standing, although that's part of it, and you're seeing it from where you're sitting. But also our eyes, in terms of spiritual eyes, is what experience we've had thus far in our lives. So that when somebody says something to us, or we experience something, or we see something, what we have experienced in the past will come and affect how we understand what's going on, and we incorporate it into our experience. And sometimes it can be a life-changing experience where we now see something because of the revelation of God. We see something we hadn't seen before. Maybe it's because it's deeper than what we had experienced before, and maybe it's something new. And that's something that God calls us to all the time. Such as it was with the disciples when Jesus came into their life. Their lives would never be the same. But isn't that true of the people in Nauvoo? Isn't that true of you and I? That if Jesus enters into our life, where he becomes a central focus, that our lives are no longer the same. We live our lives for a greater purpose. We live our lives more appreciative of the blessings that are around us. We live our lives in terms of how we act and interact and react one to another. And so what we find in our human experience, just as was mentioned here on Thursday night, is we're flawed. We sin. We fall short. And so if the perspective of going and talking about Nauvoo and going to Nauvoo is that we see a perfect people that did wonderful things and it was all good, what's our experience today? And why would we think that their experience would be somewhat different? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as LDS or even Mormon, when they look at Nauvoo, center to what they're looking at is marriage. Now, you might say, well, that would be for us too. However, let me say something about marriage, because I've said this in the meetings, is that there's kind of within the LDS view, there's a three-legged stool with marriage. One does involve polygamy. And as you visit with them, you can have discussion on that subject. But obviously, for all of us, if someone would come to you and want to talk to you about your mother or father, and all they wanted to say were mean and nasty things, you would find that your reaction would be somewhat different, certainly if you had a good experience. And so with polygamy, it becomes a conundrum for them because it's in their history, practiced in their history, and yet they recognize it creates some difficulties. But the second leg is celestial marriage. And when you talk to LDS about the temple, what happens is that you really, if you're thinking about, well, I'm going to speak to them and we're going to change them to become restorationists, is that this is an area that you have to deal with. And celestial marriage, because they are sealed in the temple and they're sealed for eternity, that is paramount to their experience. And we don't understand them unless we understand how they view marriage. And the third part of the three-legged stool is a term that some of you might not be familiar with, exaltation. Exaltation was in the same revelation in their Doctrine and Covenants, not in ours, that dealt with polygamy. And the idea of exaltation is that how do you get around the scripture in the New Testament that says that in the time to come we will not be in marriage or given in marriage? And yet LDS will seal for eternity. The way that you deal with that is this term exaltation. And exaltation is where those who are sealed, those who have gone through the temple rites, are exalted above the angels. And so their life experience in eternity is different than others. And so they can be sealed for eternity. Now, we can come into their presence and argue and debate and confront. But what happens is as Stephen Covey said in the Seven Habits, and I forget the rest of you might remember the book, but what he said was, let us first seek to understand and then be understood. And so what happens is to try to understand something about what was happening in Nauvoo is that we need to try to understand what was going on in that period. And then from that, we might formulate our experience as to what it is that we believe, what it is that took place that we agreed with, and what it is that took place that we would have questions about. And you know, it's okay to have questions, because when we look at the scriptures, we see human beings living out their lives. And we see in the scriptures that oftentimes they did not live it out perfectly. And so I'm the wrong teacher if we're going to talk about Nauvoo and try to put icing on the cake and make it real sugary and say, okay, this is it. However, I am a believer in the restored gospel. And I can believe that those people lived out their lives in dedication and in trust in the Lord and desired to serve the Lord every bit as strongly as I attempt to live it out in my life. And yet, if you're going to examine my life, you will see that I am a flawed person, and you're going to see times when I come up short. And I know this. Now, why do I start there? Because if we're going to view a time in history, and if we are going to try to understand history, we have to be real about it, so that it's okay if we have questions. Today, how often do we say about somebody living their life, well, why did they do it that way? Why, if they're out of work, don't they do this? And so what we find is it's very easy for us to judge, and what we understand then is, like others would judge us, is that sometimes we don't understand fully what took place. And folks, how can we look at something that took place in the 1840s and say for a certainty that we fully understand what was going through their minds, what they did, how they did it, and whether it was always good, bad, or indifferent? So, that then brings us to Nauvoo. What we have in front of us is a map, and I have my, let's see how well this will show up. Hopefully you can see that. Linda was very kind to bring this up for me. I asked her yesterday. What I want to do is just kind of lead us to Nauvoo, and this is a perfect map because it has the designation of how the church moved, and we're going to do this very quickly. Sharon, Vermont is where Joseph Smith Jr. was born in 1805, December 23rd. His family, seeking a better life, moved into this area right here. We see the name Palmyra. Some of the events that took place there would have been the experience in the grove and also the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And we would have known that that is a hill that we referred to as Hill Cumorah. From that point, there was a continued exodus west, and they came to Kirtland, Ohio. This is where they met people, Sidney Rigdon, Parley Pratt, and were added to the group. And there was a great influx of people, and it was a time of great encouragement. They stayed in Kirtland for the better part of the decade of the 1830s. We know that there a temple was built that still exists, owned by the Community of Christ, the Kirtland Temple. There were things that took place here in the dynamics of the church which were positive, and there was some struggle. Now, if you're going to say, what was struggle? My purpose for doing this is my faith in Jesus Christ, my faith in those who came before us is great. But I will say, some of the struggles that took place in Kirtland was they had a banking situation which placed the church in great debt. Also, what took place there is that during that period, the witnesses of the Book of Mormon were separated from the church. And it was a time of some upheaval, but also a marvelous experience, because you've heard testimony of what took place in the coming forth of the Kirtland Temple. Many revelations were given in this location. And so it was a time of great remembrance. We saw the church there where the elders would become endowed, and they would go forth, and within England there were thousands that were baptized, and the word spread around. At the same time, Kirtland, there is right over here, Independence, Missouri, where the church was actually functioning in both places. David Whitmer, one of the three witnesses, was actually placed in the presidency, which would have been more like a stake presidency, not president of the church. Joseph Smith Jr. was that. And in there, we know, because of our history, that there were trials that took place, and eventually the saints were ordered by the governor under an extermination order to not only leave Independence, but to leave the state of Missouri. And from that, there were experiences like Hans Mill and some other places where there were actually some battles fought and some deaths. At the same time, in this area, is when Joseph Smith Jr., along with a few others, were taken into prison at Liberty Jail, of which some of you have already been to, and if not, it's very close by. And in that experience, they were separated from the rest of the saints who were still up in here in the far west area. When the extermination order came on, Joseph and the few others were still in the jail at Liberty. The people here had to move, and so what they did is they headed east, and they crossed over the Mississippi River, which was frozen. Emma Smith, the wife of Joseph Smith Jr., had the manuscript of the inspired version. It was not produced or published at that point. She carried it in her dress, and she also had 3 young boys, and it was a remarkable experience. But the people gathered over here. You see this place of Nauvoo. That at that time was actually called the City of Commerce, Illinois. The saints found refuge for a time in this area, and they were able to purchase Carthage. It was renamed Nauvoo, which is a Hebrew term, beautiful city. And if you've been to Nauvoo before, you know that it sits on the Mississippi River, and there's a bend right there, and it really is a beautiful spot. I will ask you, how many of you have been to Nauvoo before? Okay, not surprising that a clear majority have been there. And what happened for Joseph and the other captives, Sidney Rigdon, Lyman White, they, in this jail, is where first Joseph Smith III had hands laid upon, and not only does Joseph give an account, he was born in 1832 in November, and this would have been later in 1838 or 39. We don't know the exact date, but so he would have been 6 or 7 years old. He remembered the experience. He didn't remember the words, but Lyman White, who was one of the people that was also in jail, did remember the blessing as well and testified to it. But at that point, because they had been taken into custody with not really strong charges against them, they were allowed to escape. And so they did, and they then came over here and eventually met up with the people. And from the period of pretty much 1840 to, I'll start first with 1844, because that's when Joseph was martyred. That was the center of the church right there. They started on, did not complete, the building of the temple of Nauvoo. When we go there, most of you then, since you have experience, know already that there you will see a temple there built on the location of the original temple. But since the first one was destroyed by fire and by enemies of the church, they had to be rebuilt, and the LDS did do that, and it was dedicated about 15 years ago. So now we are centered right here. I will say, because I only covered the LDS, the Community of Christ have unique perspectives about the Nauvoo period. But my purpose isn't to go through and try to make this a theological, historical debate. But again, it's interesting to see the differences. Within the Restoration, we hold this period of time in great esteem because we believe in the inspired version, which because of Emma preserving them, and I'm going to tell later a testimony of Emma in Nauvoo where she was under physical danger. But because of the strength of her character, she actually withstood and preserved the manuscript. Emma's a very important character for us to look at in this whole process. So what we have in the inspired version in Revelations 12:7 is it talks about there was a woman who came out of the wilderness and she had a child. And it then says that the woman was the church and the child was the kingdom of God. When someone would ask, what's the mission statement of the Restoration? Well, it starts with Jesus Christ, but we have been brought into being to be the instrument, the church, that will be assisting the Lord in bringing forth the kingdom of God on earth. And from that comes all of our meaning as a people. It is our focus. That paragraph could be lifted and be given as a mission statement. And so from Nauvoo, the word was to go out into the whole world. Now, you've heard me share the testimony, though. When they left independence, Section 102 of the Doctrine and Covenants says that it had to do with the disobedience of the saints. And so, in that generation, the word never, from these points, never went back in any significance to Independence, Missouri. That would not come until another generation. But from here, the word was going forth and was being sent out to the world. And there were people that were coming into Nauvoo. At one point, Nauvoo was the largest city in the state of Illinois. Now, if you're saying, oh, did I hear you say that right? At one point, Nauvoo was the largest city of Illinois, even larger than Chicago. That's telling you the impact of those who would go out. Now, we know from our history things that would take place in Nauvoo. But because I have next week, I'm going to kind of deal next week with the end time in Nauvoo and then the aftermath of Nauvoo. But for today's purposes, what we find is certain things started to take place. Because of the fact that they escaped from Missouri, they were still a wanted people, the ones who escaped. There were efforts to get them back to Missouri. Consequently, there were stretches of time where Joseph Smith was not seen because of feeling a danger, because under an extermination order, it wasn't going to be possibly a very good thing to return to that place. And one thing we'd have to kind of put into perspective history, Missouri became a state in 1820. It didn't have a long track record. And be quite frank, maybe I could say this because I'm from New Jersey. Missouri didn't have a good record. If you go down to the Capitol building, they have in the rotunda, they have paintings of the history of Missouri. Missouri was a slave state. That's what the Missouri the 1820 Compromise of 1820 was. Missouri entered as a slave state. Maine came in as a free state. And so you have that history of slavery. And remember, the majority of saints were coming from this part of the USA. And so they were considered Northerners. And they're coming into a slave state where, if you're familiar with church history, Alexander Donovan, who saved Joseph's life because he disobeyed an order by his commander that Joseph was to be executed, and he refused to do it. Well, Alexander Donovan himself was a slave owner. And so there was that great tension that came. Another thing that created tension is what was the purpose of the Book of Mormon? As it says, to go forth to the Lamanites. So what happened is that there were missions that were going out into Kansas and working with people, Native Americans. That was not highly prized by some of the Missourians because the fear was there would be more rifles and other things placed into their hands, and there would be greater danger. So what we find is that there was great tension there. And so when Joseph went to Illinois, there was still this great tension that was taking place. But we have to recognize the day in which we're talking about here. We find, and I'm not going to get political at all on this, but we find today that we're having difficulty in looking back at our history. I happen to was born and raised a few minutes away from Philadelphia. Just this past week, if you remember the singer Kate Smith, she was well known for singing God Bless America. The statues of Kate Smith have been covered because of what they found in some of her recordings in terms of strong racial overtones. Now, why do I raise that? I'm not trying to make that an issue. What I'm saying is that as we look at history, when we look at it through the 21st century eyes, we're not going to fully understand what it was like to be in the 19th century and for the church to come into an environment that was pro-slavery, which a governor on his own, without going through Congress, without going through the president, can sign an extermination order, of which was not rescinded until the World Conference of 1976. Now, that was an oversight, but the governor, Kit Bond, signed that to end the extermination order. But what that shows us is that that's not just something that was made up or something that was kind of, well, they didn't really have their heart into it, is that no, that was on the records. And it stayed long enough down to where most of us were still alive when that extermination order was taken off. So now, when we look at Nauvoo, we find some things that will happen. You know, when the saints came to independence, in the very beginning, there was a book being produced, the Book of Commandments, of which the printing press was destroyed and the plates were destroyed. Do you know that in Nauvoo, the church did the very same thing to some dissidents of the church who had put out a publication? Now, brothers and sisters, you're going to say, well, is he trying to destroy our faith here? We have to understand the time period. Destroying printing presses happened quite often. I'm not saying that justifies it. I'm not saying that Kate Smith was justified in singing some of the songs with some of the lyrics that she sang, but I do have to give an appreciation for the fact that for me here in 2019 to look back at 1840 to 44 and say, oh, well, how could they have done this? And why did this happen? And so what's going to happen as we go around Nauvoo is we're going to hear stories. And if you go to the LDS properties and you ask them a question about polygamy, what do you think you're going to hear? Joseph Smith Jr. was a polygamist. What you're going to hear is that it was already in operation. Now, I will tell you in our discussions, because of the fact that we can be open with each other, we were talking about this thing, and I will say that the LDS were talking about the pro-polygamy stance and how Joseph was a polygamist and how that it was accepted in Nauvoo at that period. I will tell you, those who represented the history department of the Community of Christ were saying the same thing. So, hearing that, I raised a point to them. And I said, well, it's my understanding that for something to be approved in the Doctrine and Covenants, it needs to be received by the prophet, and then it goes to the church and does not become revelation until it is proved by the church. And I'm going to tell you, that's exactly the way it works within the churches. And so, if you can think about where I'm going with this, so I said to them, then what you're telling me is, if Joseph Smith Jr. was practicing polygamy and the LDS will go all the way back to 1832, then you're telling me that he was a transgressor because he was doing something before it was accepted by the church as revelation and placed in the Doctrine and Covenants. Now, I'm going to tell you, as they're looking at me, there was no response. Because either he didn't do it or he was a transgressor. And so what I'm getting at is that when we look at the perspectives of the 1840s, we have to think through historically what that means. And so I add that to your understanding. Now, we've come to the end, but I'm going to ask if there's any questions, and it may not be that I could respond to them. I don't know if I can answer them. I don't know everything. But if there's a question that I might need to work on this week, is there something that you have about this Nauvoo period that you would particularly like to know more about, have questions about, that I can make some preparation this week on?
So point to, or that you have discovered in your studies, that was the Achilles heel, or what was it that brought the church down after such a phenomenal period?
Okay, I don't think there's a single thing, but I will respond to that because I think I can say something towards that. What happened is, from the experience that happened in Missouri, I believe the church understandably had some reaction to that. They were in danger. Some of the saints were killed in battle. Their leadership was taken into prison with orders for them to be shot. That, in human reaction, is hard not to react to. I mean, let's face it. Would we not have some reaction in the same situation? When they went over to Nauvoo, some things started to pop up. Joseph ran for president of the United States. They developed a legion, a militia, and in that they had ranks of commanders. And here's what I'm going to say about that, is that the reaction and having reaction is understandable. But the difficulty is because we know what Jesus said. Love those who persecute you. And the problem is that it's the same way with us. If we get persecuted and we react so strongly that we get distracted from what our purpose is, which is to witness of Jesus Christ, to build up the church, and to bring about the kingdom of God on earth. If we get distracted, what happens is we now have compromised our position. Now that's somewhat of a thought from me. We can talk about it more, but I felt that I could respond in that way. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about what happened in Nauvoo, but like I said, we're going to then talk about the martyrdom and what that domino effect created, and then also the aftermath of it. Yes?
You said that Joseph Smith ran for president?
Yes.
I thought he turned it down. He turned it down because he knew what was going to happen.
It never got any steam because the election year was 1844, and he was, as you know, martyred that particular year. So what happened was, though, is that we see in the writings is that he had at least entertained, but might have even gone further of thinking of seriously doing it. However, with what was to transpire in 1844, that was not possible. But what I come back to, the fact is that there were distractions that took place because the church was under threat and persecution. Okay, God bless us in this Resurrection Sunday. May He add His Spirit to us as we worship and honor Him. Thank you.